So if we want to do implementation, it's helpful to know what clinical things we should be trying to implement, and it's helpful to know what's been tried before and what might be relevant to us. But I think a key recognition of this area is that you have different barriers and facilitators across different behaviors, across different settings, across different professional groups. And if we actually want to design a strategy that's going to be successful, we need to understand what those barriers and facilitators are that will allow us to hopefully identify interventions that target the right pathways. And so here's just my aid memoir about barriers to implementation. And the key issue here is when I started, most of the debate was assuming that the main barrier was somehow professional knowledge. And that led to rather simplistic views that if we just give professionals more knowledge, all our quality problems will go away. And I think, first of all, we can demonstrate that's not the case, but actually there's a range of other barriers that get in the way of healthcare professionals enacting knowledge that they often have. So these can occur at the structural level if you have financial disincentives. In the 1990s, I did some work with a professor of obstetrics from Harare University in Zimbabwe. He was one of the trialists that did the trial that showed without doubt that magnesium sulfate was the treatment of choice for management of eclampsia. It had been the standard of care in the US, but was not the standard of care in Europe. But about 2 years after he had been an author on the trial published in The Lancet, he could not prescribe magnesium sulfate for women coming into his hospital with eclampsia. And the reason being was that the WHO, or the Zimbabwean government at the time, purchased drugs according to the WHO essential drugs list. And the WHO had not updated their essential drugs list at the time. So this is a kind of supranational barrier to someone in a local environment who knew the evidence backward, had generated it, which got in the way of him providing that. A few years later, WHO did change their essential drugs list. Zimbabwe government started to put this onto their formularies, and that raised a whole range of other issues in the Zimbabwean system in terms of drug supply and also drug chains. But the original barrier was at this sort of coverage, or this international coverage level. There can be barriers at the organizational level if we don't have the right skill mix, or we have a lack of facilities or equipment. There's increasing interest in thrombolysis for the management of stroke, but that actually requires potentially eligible patients to have some form of either MRI or CT scan within 3 hours of the onset of their symptoms. It's creeping up maybe 4 hours now. But in a country like Canada, where you have people working and living in very rural and remote areas, we're probably going to have to accept that there are a number of patients or citizens who are living in communities where we could never even think of offering them thrombolysis because it's never going to be economically viable to situate sort of scanning centers close enough to them to actually be able to deliver what we think of as an effective treatment. There can be barriers of the peer group. Human beings are social organisms, and when we work together, we start to develop a shared set of beliefs about how the world works and shared ways of doing things. And if we then are trying to introduce a change which goes against those shared beliefs, it's very challenging because we can't just, we have to address the issues of the peer group and not just of individuals. It's very difficult for individuals to change their behaviors if their peer group don't think they should do that. My experience of this when I was training as a family doc, I'd go between different hospital wards and people would do things differently. And no one said, we do things differently here because we're evidence-based and that ward you just came from is terrible and they don't do evidence-based. It's just that something had maybe happened 10 years ago or someone had said something and somehow a practice had emerged and somehow it became ossified, and that's how we did it here. And that's actually really hard to change if you're trying to improve quality of care across the population of practices. There can be barriers at the individual level. These could be related to knowledge, attitudes, or skills. As I mentioned, for non-emergent knowledge where we have major quality gaps, our experience to date is that this is not a professional knowledge issue. People know what they should do, but these other things are getting in the way. But there are, I think, issues in relation to skills and also sort of communication skills that we may also need to address. The final issue is that there are limits to human information processing. So the cognitive psychologist will say that human beings have got bounded rationality. We don't have supercomputers of brains. We have probably 486 architecture. And there are some people in the room who won't understand that reference, but there are lots of people who are. So if you don't understand the reference, just ask someone who kind of is losing some of their hair and has a bit of the gray stuff here, and they'll tell you what a 486 computer was. But the issue about this is because we have limits about how we process information, we try not to think. We spend most of our time trying not to think, because thinking is an incredibly resource-intensive activity for us. And so the way we do this is we develop automatic behaviors, and we develop scripts. And the classic outside a clinical model automatic behavior is you get in your car and you drive home, and when you get home, you can't remember particularly sort of how you got there, whether you turned right at the turn that you always did. It's just an automatic behavior. You're not using your cognitive processing power when you're driving home, unless there's an accident, and all of a sudden you have to think about rerouting. And all of a sudden your brain kicks in and you're thinking, oh, right, okay, now can I go left here, can I go somewhere else? But in general, we try not to use our brain because it actually takes a lot of energy. Another way that manifests itself is we also have scripts. And I think particularly in clinical environments, clinicians over time work through ways in which they can talk with patients and relatives that seem to work for them. And will get across the key issues that they want to get across. But one of the things is, if you've got a script, as soon as you turn it on, you stop thinking. So I've not seen a patient for 15 years, but I can turn on the script I had about why you don't need an antibiotic for your sore throat. And as soon as I got to that point in the consultation and turned that script on, it allowed me to think about other things. What else do I have to talk to this patient about? I'm running late. Who else is waiting out there for me? Or who's going to pick the kids up? Or, I don't know, who's going to win the hockey tonight? Those sort of things can kind of come into your brain after that. But scripts are very hard to change because you've often crafted them over many years. And if you're trying to change a script in a real time, you're going to start stumbling. You're going to sort of say, well, I don't think you need an antibiotic because of, and I think there's a real issue because certainly when I was doing this, it made me feel very exposed. The patient was in front of me and I was stammering in front of them because I was trying to work out what else I had to say. The patient was looking at me in terms of, do you not know how to treat a sore throat? This is pretty family practice 101. Why are you struggling? And so these are things that are, they're part of our human limitations, and they're ways that we use scripts and automatic behaviors to overcome them. And they work probably 98% of the time. That's why they're so good, because we can use them and they get good results with our patients. But it's really hard to change automatic behaviors or scripts in real time. The final limit of our human information processing is we can only handle certain numbers or a certain amount of information or decisions at any one point in time. And if you think about a clinical scenario, we're often asking the clinicians to really be juggling a whole range of sort of different factors in their heads. And when we ask people to make complex decisions under time-pressured, chaotic environments, they make mistakes, they forget to do things, they have acts of omission. And again, it's partly because we're human beings, and human beings are fallible. Clem MacDonald in 1976 wrote about the non-perfectibility of man, and we haven't perfected man since then. And so these are real challenges that we face when we think about the barriers to implementation. There are many different ways of thinking about how you want to address implementation. For the last probably 10 to 15 years, I've been particularly interested in looking at this from a behavioral perspective. And my argument would be that implementation depends on the behaviors of citizens, patients, health professionals, managers, or policymakers. If we want to improve care, we often need to change behaviors. And if we want to change behaviors, it helps to understand determinants of current behavior and how behavior changes. So in other words, there's actually a lot of information out there about what drives our behaviors and how to change behaviors. We can actually use that to think about how we might be smarter in the way that we design programs. This is a framework that we found particularly useful. It's been developed by a health psychologist in the UK called Susan Meeke. And Susan is a very senior health psychologist who is very passionate about health psychology and thought that health psychology could help with things like implementation. But she was also aware that just a profusion of theory in health psychology was a barrier to actually using health psychology. So you have different theories that seem to say the same thing using different language. And other theories seem to use the same language but mean subtly different things. And unless you're a PhD psychologist, it's actually very hard to access or use that. So what she did is to start to say, well, actually across all of these theories, it's not that there are 1,000 ways of looking at behavior. There's probably a limited number of factors, but when people have developed theories, they've sort of parceled them in different ways. So she took 128 constructs from 33 different theories that were well validated and said, how many unique ideas are there across these 128 constructs? And the first time round, she came up with 12. That across this broad range of psychological theory, determinants of behavior include knowledge, skills, professional role and identity, beliefs about capabilities, beliefs about consequences, motivation and goals, memory, attention, decision processes, environmental context, social influences, emotion and behavioral regulation. And they also provided a qualitative interview schedule that would allow you within about a half an hour to 45 minutes interview, basically with clinical target audiences, work through which of the key areas or which of these domains are most important in terms of driving the behaviors we've got. We once did an interview in 12 minutes with an orthopedic surgeon, and I think the most we had was an hour, but it's a relatively good way of covering a very broad range of potential barriers as you move it forward. One of the things I would argue is this comes from a health psychology perspective. So environmental context and resources is a really sort of scrunched down category that if you're an organizational scientist, you'd look at this and think, that is just so naive and we need to explode that. And I also think the memory, attention, decision processes puts all of cognitive psychology into one area, and again, you might want to explode that. So it's not perfect, and we need to think about how we bring in interdisciplinary perspectives to expand that, but I think it's a very useful starting point for thinking about how we assess barriers. We're just starting to publish a series of the experiences we use this in the UK, Australia, and Canada in implementation science. And here's one of the first papers we published where we actually use this to explore determinants of clinicians' blood use in intensive care units. And we've now done this across a range of different professional groups, behaviors, and settings.